Hey everyone, I'm your host representing Essentials in Ministries, and welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something absolutely crucial. We are going to break down the blinding, destructive nature of pride, and we're going to contrast it with the incredible, life-altering power of humility. If you have ever struggled with ego, or maybe you've watched it completely derail a great leader, you know exactly how vital this conversation is. So let's kick things off with a foundational truth that really sets the stage for everything we're going to explore today. 1 Peter 5:5 says, "God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Now, this isn't just a poetic proverb, right? It's literally a spiritual law of gravity. When we elevate ourselves, we are met with divine resistance. But the moment we lower ourselves, that's when the grace flows in. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. The trap of pride. 2. The arrogance and shame cycle. 3. The science of humility. 4. Humility promotes true fairness. And finally, 5. The plateau of sustainability. Let's jump right in. Section 1. The trap of pride, the spiritual and historical danger. We've got to start by looking at the core problem here, because pride is incredibly deceitful and, frankly, it is completely blinding. It whispers that we're totally self-sufficient right up until the exact moment everything falls apart. Throughout biblical history, pride has been this massive stumbling block. Just think about the tragic story of Samson. The guy wasn't just figuratively blinded by his own desires, his pride directly led to him being literally, physically blinded by his enemies. Or if you want to look at a grander scale, look at the ultimate fall of great empires like the mighty kingdom of Babylon. It completely collapsed under the sheer weight of its own arrogance. The prophet Jeremiah hits the nail on the head when he describes the human heart as deceitful and wicked. We can so easily convince ourselves that we're right, even when we are miles off course. When you put these two side by side, it is literally night and day. Pride ignores deep convictions, even when someone is dead wrong. It's just a self-sabotaging tornado. Humility, on the other hand, actively invites grace. And hey, just a quick reminder for us all, true modesty is about internal character. We're keeping it strictly modest in the mirror today, folks, so no flexing our spiritual or physical abs here. True humility is all about having a realistic, modest self-view and keeping your heart totally open to correction. Okay, section 2, the arrogance and shame cycle, the Dunning-Kruger effects in ministry. Let's move in a bit and see how this spiritual trap actually manifests in modern practice, especially when we look at church growth and pastoral leadership. As Elmer Towns notes, and author Carl Vaders points out, there's been this massive shift toward measuring success strictly by numbers, new techniques and programs. But here's the catch. When everything has to be quantified and measured, we inevitably end up comparing ourselves to others. And comparison? It is a dangerous engine. It either fuels pride because you feel bigger and better than the next guy, or it fuels deep shame because you feel smaller and totally inadequate. This whole dynamic brilliantly illustrates a famous psychological concept called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Picture a graph. At step 1, you've got the peak of overconfidence. Think of a first-year theology student or a young pastor seeing some quick numerical growth. They feel totally invincible. But then the harsh, complex realities of actual human ministry hit them like a ton of bricks, plunging them straight down into step 2. The valley of underconfidence. This is exactly where the shame kicks in, and sadly, it's where a lot of leaders just throw in the towel and give up. So the million-dollar question is, how do you survive that valley? Well, surviving the valley of underconfidence requires what Vaders calls the gap of humility. This gap basically acts as a necessary cushion. If a leader can stay humble and just keep learning, they begin climbing the slope of experience. That allows their confidence and their actual experience to finally grow at the exact same sustainable rate. That is what keeps them completely free from getting sucked back into that toxic arrogance and shame cycle. That brings us to section 3, the science of humility, empirical evidence of a foundational virtue. Let's pivot for a second from ministry trends over to hard empirical psychology to see exactly how humility alters our psychological positioning. Like, does humility actually change how we treat people in a measurable way? A fascinating recent study published by Wang and their team gives us a resounding yes. They prove that humility isn't just some nice, abstract theological concept floating out there. It actively and tangibly promotes measurable fairness in human interactions. To prove this, the researchers measured behavior using 2 classic economic games. First, you've got the dictator game. This represents high situational power. Basically, one person holds all the cards and decides exactly how to split a pot of money, and the other person just has to accept it. No negotiating. The second is the ultimatum game, which represents low situational power. Here, a person proposes a split, but if the second person rejects it, nobody gets a single dime. The researchers basically wanted to see if people would exploit their absolute power or if they would choose to remain fair. Moving to Section 4, humility promotes true fairness, adhering to internal principles. The results they found beautifully bridge the gap between our theological definitions of character and hard behavioral science. The data on this is just fascinating. They found that individuals who naturally had high trait humility, or even those who were just temporarily primed to think about humility by reading a story, behaved significantly more fairly. And here's the real kicker. They behaved fairly even in the dictator game. Even when they held absolute unchecked power to be completely selfish, they chose fairness. So why exactly does this happen? The study shows that adopting a humble psychological posture actively shrinks our self-enhancement bias. When you're humble, you just don't feel this aggressive need to compete for resources. Instead, you genuinely recognize the legitimate interests, worth, and needs of the people around you. You treat them fairly because you see them as equally valuable, totally regardless of whether you have the power to step on them or not. Which leads us to our final section, number 5. The plateau of sustainability, synthesizing the solution. So, how do we pull all of this together? How do we combine this profound spiritual mandate with the hard science of behavioral psychology to actually build lasting, sustainable leadership? To answer this vital question, we have to look at the very structure of intellectual humility, and we need to reconsider how we're commanded to live our daily lives. In other words, what actually makes a person truly, sustainably humble? Philosopher Ian Boddy lays this out perfectly for us. He explains that true humility requires twin engines. First, you have what experts call epistemic low self-focus. That really just means accurately assessing your own personal limits without feeling the need to inflate your ego. And second, dispositional high other focus. That simply means deeply empathizing with others and actively elevating their needs. It's this perfect, beautiful balance of thinking of yourself less while thinking of others more. And this perfectly echoes the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. He firmly warned against causing others to stumble out of our own vanity and pride. He reminded his followers that to achieve true greatness, we have to lay aside that towering Babylonian pride, and instead we have to adopt the total, unpretentious dependence of a little child. I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on today. True leadership, and honestly, a truly impactful life, isn't found sitting on top of some blinding peak of arrogance. It's found right there on the sustainable plateau, a plateau built entirely by a quiet, radically fair, and deeply humble heart. Thank you so much for joining me on The Explainer today. I challenge you to look for real ways to embrace that gap of humility this week.